We're going to have a look at some of the supporting components. Going to be categories and activities, which is built a lot like Teams, the structure of the components, and then have a deeper look at resources. So that's going to be things that support checklists and checklist items, like more information to help people who are using those checklists. And it's going to be things like resources that are, say, videos or URLs or even markdown language. So let's have a look. Let's have a look at categories and activities. I won't spend too long on this because it really follows the same pattern as I use for Teams and users. There's some little twists in it, but mostly the same. Categories does what it says. It categorizes things like checklists, so it's in support of checklists, so you can look for checklists that are in a certain category. Also categorizes things like resources, so you can look for resources that tied to a certain category. Categories could be just about anything, so it could be a hobby, say like fishing, electronics, or it could be something like software development, an area in a corporation. Under categories are activities. So activities are a sub-collection of categories. Each category just has its own unique activities. So again, for example, for say a category around software development, there could be activities for requirements management or testing that you want. And activities are used for tagging things like checklist items. So later on when we do metrics on checklists, we may want to find out what's the results of our checklists for just one activity. Say again for requirements management, we want to look across all checklists and find how many requirement management activities were successfully completed. Okay, looking at the structure of the categories and activities, so again it follows the team user kind of structure of master detail. So top level there's the categories component, which is a list of categories, and the user can add new categories from this component as well. Underneath that is the category component, so from categories you can get to a specific category or create a new category. Inside the category component is the category activity list component, so that's the list of activities associated with that category. Again, you can add activities from that component. And finally, that category activity list component can take you to the activity component, which is where you work on a single activity. Inside checklists, categories look like this. So you go to the categories component, which is the top level list of categories that have been set up. As well, you can create a new category from here or delete existing categories. From here you could go to look at a specific category. So again, going into the child component of the categories, and you can update the name and the description as well. Inside there is the activities list. From there you can add a new activity, or else you can go in and edit existing activities or delete existing activities. So if I click on one of those, it then takes me to the activities component. Okay, now let's have a look at resources. So again, this is a supporting document, and it's used on checklists and checklist items, and it's a way of having more information for the person who's using the checklist or looking at the checklist item about that particular checklist or checklist item. So it may be educational, maybe a video telling how to do something. So again, with the example of fishing as a category for a checklist, it may be saying how to do fly fishing, or maybe information about how to set up your boat, something like that. And resources can be represented in different ways, and that's what this resource type down here does. It could be a URL to more information, so it could be a URL to say a Wikipedia article. It could be a YouTube video, so by putting in a YouTube ID it points that resource to a YouTube. It could be just a file, so it could be a form or something to be used for that particular checklist or checklist activity. It could be a piece of markdown language, so just a document using markdown, or it could be just an image. And there's these different types that are shown on resource, and this resource type tells the application how that resource should be represented, whether it should be shown as a video, whether it should be shown as an image, or maybe for files just as a downloadable icon. Resources have owners, so there's a reference to the owner who's a user. They also have reviewers, has a review date for periodically checking that resources are up to date. Has a way of managing supersessions, so say for example for a particular form there may be a new version of that form, so you want to supersede it but still have the old form available as a resource as well, so being able to explicitly showing that supersession. Has a status, so things can be active, can be superseded, can be logically deleted based on the status of the resource. And the other thing is some of the resources are represented by objects that are held in cloud storage. So I'm using Google's Firestore storage system, where I can store large objects of any type, so different large files. And later on I'll show how those files are associated with the particular resource document in the database. And we see here for resources, I also had to document the rules I was going to use around resources. Resources are kind of complicated because different people have different access to the resources. Most people, or all people, have read access to resources, but who can update resources is dependent on a variety of things, on whether the person's an admin or whether they're a resource manager as indicated on their user record. Or whether they're, say, a team manager and the resources associated with a team, they can also update those resources. There's also rules about reviewers, about what they can update. So they can view resources, but they can only update the status and the date reviewed as a reviewer. They can't update the actual content. So this slide just shows you what rules I'd put together for resources and then implemented as Firebase rules or rules in the actual code of the components. Now my FBM starter application does not include any Firebase storage capabilities. So first thing I needed to do was go into my Firebase project and then add storage in. This isn't my actual project, but it just shows you what it looks like when you add storage to your existing Firebase project. So I'd click on storage, I'd say get started. I look at this, see if this is a good starting set of rules for me to use for access to the storage. This is basically saying everyone has full access as long as they've been authenticated. I'll actually change that around later. And then what storage location I want for it. So for me, US Central is good. Then I'll click on Done. What this does is adds a storage identifier to my project settings, which I brought back into my project. The other thing I had to do was inside the actual project, I ran the Firebase CLI and added storage in as an option, and that allows me to set up a file called storage rules in the top level of my project. And in here, this is where the rules around what access there should be. So again, this has still got just the generic storage rules, so I'll probably change this around to change it to anyone who's authenticated can have read, but tighten down on write access to align with those rules I showed earlier. Let's have a look at some of the unique things happening with the code. So quickly, just a quick look at the resource components. Again, it's a listing of resources, and then under that are the individual resources to manage. So you see here there's resources of different types in my list here. So for example, this is a YouTube resource. So if I go into that resource, you see in this area here, which I call the content area, in this case it's marked as a YouTube video, and down the bottom here it's going to show the link to the YouTube ID, or the actual YouTube ID to use, and then a view of that video so someone can review to make sure they've got the right link. So a different example would be say this one here, which is document requirements management, and if I click on that, we see in this case it's a type file, and the dynamic area here looks a little different. It gives a link to be able to update the file with a local file, so I can put a different file up here, and this actually gets saved out in storage. Another example might be this one here, which shows an example of resource that is a resource with markdown language. So you see down here, this is just an editable area that you can use markdown syntax to create a document, and you can also view the resulting document to see what it looks like when the markdown gets applied. So the interesting thing here is that depending on the resource type, this area down here looks different, and it actually has different validators as well. So I'm going to have a quick look at the code to see how this was implemented. Other thing to be aware of is down here you have the ability to supersede any of the resources. If I click on that, then you can confirm that you're going to supersede it, because it makes the old resource inactive, makes a new copy of that resource which you can edit after that. But they want to make sure you really want to do this. I'm going to say no at the moment, but we'll have a look at the code that implemented supersession as well. As well, on this form, there's some pop-ups for selecting the team that this is associated with, so you can just click the team and update it, and you can select the category this might be associated with. So let's go with phishing. So here we've updated those. You can also select users who are, say, the reviewer, so I can change that to me as well. So those are all ways of updating, as well as just the basic resource name and description. So let's have a look at the code. So first, let's have a look in the resource component and the HTML template. So the way I'm implementing the different types of content is to use this div of type container, and inside that is an ng container tag for each resource type. So you see, for example, this where it's a resource type URL. The HTML for that is unique to being a URL resource type. If it's YouTube, then the content of that ng container looks completely different, which includes a tab, mat tab control for being able to show the edit and view views for that, and so on through here. One for markdown, and also one for images. So let's go see how, as well as changing over the actual HTML, how the validators behind the content field changes as you change type as well. So we see here in the code, so first the set content validators is the function that calls in response to changing the resource type, and the resource type gets passed through to it. Brings up a confirmation dialog, just because when you do change resource type, the content that was already in there, if it already existed, gets deleted. Goes through and then calls the update content validator. So this is what actually changes the validators for the content. So again, resource type continues to get passed through, and we have a simple switch and case statements for setting the various changes to the validator. So it changes the validator. It then goes and sets the value of the content to nothing. So that's why we have that confirmation dialog, to make sure the user's aware that any old content's going to be removed. The resource type gets updated to the resource type passed in, and also the resource form control content gets updated, and the value and the validity gets applied with these new resource validators that were set up here. Okay, for supersession, so this is the function that gets called when someone clicks on the supersession button. It's only visible when you're in update mode for the component. So again, first thing supersession does is bring up a confirmation box. If we made it through this, then it calls on supersede. And what it's doing for supersede is mainly it's creating a new resource that's a copy of the existing resource. It's also setting the status of the old resource to superseded, setting the superseded field on the new resource, or supersedes field on the new resource, and returns you to resources with a snack bar notification saying that the resource has been superseded. So resources has a lot of code, and there's also a lot of code in here for managing the views into different things that are on the page, depending on the type of resource and who is allowed to update the resource. So you know whether the person is an updater. So again, we've got a function is allowed to do updates. So this is updater. So again, this is the code that implements some of those rules out there. So it checks whether they're an admin, whether they're an owner of the resource, or whether they're a manager of a team that resource is tied to, would then allow them to do some of the update functionality. Otherwise they can't update the resource. Again, a couple of supporting components for the content. So if it's markdown, a way of showing the actual markdown view of the markdown text. So with all the conversions to headers and lists and things like that. As well, we have the same thing for YouTube video, where if it's a YouTube video, it can display the actual YouTube video for the ID that's entered. The code that does this, so again in the HTML, for the view of the markdown here, so this is in the markdown version of the content container, it sets the inner HTML to the resource content, which is the straight text version of the markdown text, through a pipe called marked. So it uses the marked package, and we can see it out here on npm, the marked package. There's more information out here on how to use it, but I basically set it up as a pipe in my code. So again, if we look at the definition of the pipe, so it's using the marked package, and it's basically returning that whatever was piped through as HTML that's marked up. And we can go back to the resource HTML. Similar sort of things happening with the YouTube video too. So I have a component here called YouTube viewer, and in our mat tab for the view for YouTube, it's inserting that YouTube viewer component where I've passed the YouTube ID to it. So that's most of the main parts of the resource component. It's probably the most complicated component yet in the application. With that, all the supporting components are in place, so now I can work on the checklist and checklist item component. And again, that's probably going to be another level of magnitude more complicated than even resources, because there's a lot of rules about who can use checklists, what they see on checklists, what's the status of the checklists, and also flowing through the components and being able to support checklist templates, so people can take a copy of a checklist and reuse them for other activities as well.